And I've been there we go. Thanks, Vicki. I've been a hazardous materials chemist for about 30 years. I've worked in industry. I've worked in government agencies, and then I've also worked, I've been a consultant now on my own for about almost the last 20 years. So I work with a lot of different clients. I work with a lot of industry clients, but I also assist government agencies and particularly schools. So that's kind of one of my passions, is to make sure that we have chemical management safe in schools. And that has been a continual ongoing challenge for the last 25 years. So I did do a stint as an emergency responder. So I'm also very involved in the emergency response community, and I continue to volunteer knowledge to our local emergency planning commission, and then also to our local hazardous materials team. So, and I've done a lot of teaching over the last 20 years. I teach HAZWOPER, DOT, and EPA regulations. So I've got a lot of experience, and with that experience has come some crazy adventures, and I've seen some very unique things over the years. So I'm hoping to share that information with you today, show you some crazy pictures of stuff that we've received in and seen on different sites, and make sure, again, the overall arching message here is to keep you and your folks safe as you're out in the field or as you're working at HHW facilities. So we're going to get started on that kind of stuff. A lot of the photos here are photos that I have taken on various sites. I also just want to give a quick shout out to my wonderful mentor and friend, Dave Waddell. Dave has provided me with a number of photos and training. He retired a few years ago, and he's just overall a fantastic human and has provided us with a lot of information for today as well. I want to say thank you to Vicki Davis and Mia Rothlein. They are both instrumental in getting this information out, and also applying for the grants and getting the funding source for us to be able to do this. So the funding is from USDA. So thank you also to USDA for providing us with this funding. And you can see on that first slide, we've got a little information about the USDA grant on the bottom. So the way that we're going to work today is, if you have any questions, Vicki and I will be keeping an eye on the chat box. So please type your questions into the chat box. I'll either try to address them as we're moving through the presentation today, or if they're really complicated, I may defer them to the end. But this time is for you, and I appreciate you setting it aside. I know everyone's schedules are very, very busy. And so I want to make sure that we're addressing your questions and discussing your concerns as well. So if I can fit it in during the presentation, I will. Otherwise, we'll defer to the end. And if it's something really complicated, on the very last slide today, you'll have my contact information. So you have my phone number and my email address. And I'm happy to offer any guidance or information that I've developed over the last 30 years of doing this. Crazy how time flies. So you're welcome to email me or call. And then one last thing, since we are recording this webinar, this information is current as of July 2024. So if you are watching this webinar in 2032, chances are all of the information has changed. That's one of the things that I've identified over the last 30 years, is we see a lot of changes in this area. As we get smarter, as we learn more, as we identify impacts, the regulations change and our understanding of risk changes. So please know that as of July 2024, this is current information, but if you're watching this at a future date, if there are any regulations that you have questions about, you need to look up the current regulations at that time. All right. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and I was going to try to turn, I think I'm not going to do that. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. So I know a lot of you have a lot of experience in this arena. So goals for today are to teach you some of the tricks that I've learned, some of the information that I've gleaned over the last decades of doing this, this work. Goal number one is to make sure that I'm raising your awareness on risk that you may see at collection events. And these are from sources that maybe you have not considered. And also, I'm going to show you some photos of things that are unusual. They don't show up a lot at collection events. but they do show up and we have seen them. So I want you to be aware of them and keep an eye out for them. Next thing I want to do, second goal, is to provide strategies for you and your staff to keep you all safe when we're on site. One of the crazy things with household hazardous waste collection is that frequently we never know what's going to come in through the door. And as a result of that, keeping a safe environment for volunteers, participants, and staff can be very, very challenging. So I'm going to hopefully provide you with some information about that. And then goal number 3 is we're going to talk about some emerging issues today. And our last topic is going to get pretty sciencey and pretty technical. So I'm going to try to explain it to you to the best of my ability, but bear with me. These are some tough topics to understand. And then we're going to end today with some unusual chemicals and some photos so that you see what we've seen over the years and can keep your folks safe. All right, we're going to start with a quick overview of topics from our last webinar. If you weren't available to join us on the last webinar, I believe it's been recorded, and you're welcome to email Becky Davis, and ask for access to that. We're going to do a deep dive into 3 topics. First, we're going to talk about vaping cartridges. That has become a huge issue. We're going to focus on vaping cartridges around nicotine vaping cartridges. However, I know that THC vaping cartridges have also become a huge issue across the country. So we're going to talk about those today, the different challenges, and how you can best manage them. Secondly, we're going to talk about lithium-ion batteries. Lithium-ion batteries are presenting a number of us with nightmares. And we're going to talk about best ways to manage those. I'm going to give you the most current guidance that I have, and I'm going to show you some resources that may hopefully help protect your facilities. And then finally, we're going to talk about PFAS, polyfluorinated alkyl substances. Polyfluorinateds they've been around a long time, but they have just recently really reared their ugly heads, and we're going to talk about that. And we're going to talk about why we can't just check off the list of, hey, what are the PFAS chemicals that are out there? What are the products they're in, and how do we avoid them? It's just not that easy. So we're going to get real technical in that one, and we'll talk through it. So I want to start with just the overview of household hazardous waste. And a lot of times household hazardous waste, the vast majority of the chemicals, the waste that you receive at household hazardous waste events is pretty innocuous. It's aerosol cans, it's oil-based paint, it's used gas oil mixtures. You know, over the years, I'd guess at 95% of the materials that come into an HHW event are really fairly benign and easy to manage. We know what the risks are associated with them. We know how to handle them, and we know how to dispose of them. We work with our contractors to make sure that we've got those things in place prior to the event. The problem is those crazy, weird old ones that occasionally will come into us, or the unusual ones that will come into us. And that's what we're going to be focusing on. How do we, when we receive one of those crazy old ones in, how do we respond to that? And how do we make sure that we're prepared so that we can keep our folks safe up front? One of the ways that we do this is by understanding what our exposure risks are. So the primary exposure risks that I'm most focused on are inhalation and contact or absorption. I think those are the ones that present us with the most risk. They are typically, if we have those happen, and these are highly dangerous chemicals that we've been exposed to, the response is very acute and it's very dangerous. So those are the 2 exposure routes that, as you are building your HHW facilities or as you are setting up your HHW events, I want you to think about. How can we minimize absorption or contact? And how can we minimize inhalation exposures? The reference that everybody refers to and that people are most familiar with are safety data sheets. A lot of times, though, as we talked about in our last webinar, safety data sheets for consumer products might not be available. So what do you do in that case? You receive something in, and all of a sudden you don't have a safety data sheet for it. Safety data sheets are overseen by OSHA, and OSHA doesn't have jurisdictional authority over consumer products. So what we do there is we use a little different strategy. So let's, for example, say that we've gotten in a 1 gallon jug of that is labeled blue bug juice. Okay. We know this is windshield washer solution. We have absolutely no idea what the risks are. And gosh darn it, the bottom just fell out of the old brittle plastic container. And we've got an employee or we've got a facility person that now has this down the front of them. What do we do? The first thing we're going to do, of course, is to put that person under a shower or under some sort of decontamination water source. And we're going to flush off that exposure. Okay. Biggest thing that we can do to start with is to flush off that exposure. Then we're going to try to start finding out information depending on how injured the person is. Of course, we're going to call 911 and ask for some assistance, but we need to find out what this stuff is that they've been exposed to. Just what is blue bug juice and how dangerous is it? So we know by looking at the label on the back of the container that it contains methanol. Okay. Now, methanol, commonly used industrial chemical, and we actually can pull up a safety data sheet just for methanol. So using, smartphones, using computers on site, whatever, we're going to pull up a safety data sheet for methanol. The source that I go to most frequently, if I've got the name of a chemical and I'm trying to identify the risk, the source that I use is Sigma Aldrich. They have an enormous collection of chemicals that they supply throughout the world, and they have also exceptionally written safety data sheets. So pull up the Sigma Aldrich website, go to methanol, and download the material safety data sheet. The nice thing is they've also set up those pages so that they're very easily recognizable and readable on your cell phone. So once I get that safety data sheet for that ingredient that I've identified in the blue bug juice, I'm going to start by looking at 2 sections. Now, we all know that the safety data sheet is 16 sections long. Okay, so there's a lot of information. I'm going to give you the kind of down and dirty method to get the information that you need as quickly as possible. One of the other things I want you to think about too is, even though we're just looking up methanol, are there other ingredients in that? Safety data sheets are designed to identify one chemical, unless they're for safety data sheets for products can define compositionally all the different chemicals that are present. What they don't take into account is the synergistic effect between those chemicals. So I want you to keep that in mind also as you're identifying risk and identifying how to read those safety data sheets. Okay. So the best thing that we can do with this is we're going to concentrate on methanol, and we're going to move immediately to section 2 of that safety data sheet. Now, section 2 of the safety data sheet gives us a very high level overview of all the different risk areas and dangers associated with that particular chemical. So we're going to start in section 2.1, and it's the classification of the substance. And what you'll notice here in the classification of the substance is that there are different categories that OSHA, or that the safety data sheet author identifies. And these are based on GHS, Globally Harmonized System of Hazard Communications, the UN definitions associated with this program. Okay. The tough thing here, and the thing that at a glance that we have to make sure that we remember, is that these categories are ranked in the opposite way that the NFPA Diamond has been ranked for years. So many of us have seen the NFPA Diamond on the outside of buildings or on chemicals. The NFPA Diamond goes from 0 to 4, and 4 different categories, or 3 different categories. And the 4 indicates to us the highest level of risk. So if we come across a building and it's got 444 for health, flammability, and reactivity, that's the highest level of risk that we can see for that NFPA, or National Fire Protection Association, signage. When we look at the safety data sheet, those categories are categories 1 through 5, and category 1 is the one that is the highest level of risk. So Scott, I see you have a question that says, what are some of the identification resources that aren't online? Your facility has poor cell phone coverage and no Wi-Fi. Oh, Scott, that's really, really tough. There are some resource books that you can have. And if you email me, I can send you some references for those. The other thing you can do, boy, I tell you, that's just a really, really tough situation. I would see if there's any way that you can add in like a hotspot on a phone, especially for collection events. Because unfortunately, most of this information that we're going to rely on is going to be only available online. The problem is we have so many chemicals that are coming in, so many different types of chemicals and different ingredient combinations that it's really hard if we don't have online access. So Scott, if you want to email me after the webinar today, we can talk more about that and give you some ideas, okay? All right, back to our blue bug juice. So again, when we're looking at these categories, category 1 indicates to us that this is the highest level of risk that OSHA assigns to a particular category. So under this methanol safety data sheet, we see that flammable liquids, it's a category 2, pretty darn flammable. Acute toxicity oral, category 3. So it still makes the list, and it's about midway for risk. Category 3, on acute toxicity, inhalation and dermal. All 3 of those exposure routes, oral, inhalation, and dermal, which is contact or absorption, are category 3. That's a bad deal. That means that this stuff does have some pretty significant toxicity to it. Kind of crazy. Did you ever think that you'd see that with windshield washer solution? But this is what OSHA has determined has been the level of risk. And it's not just OSHA, it's the United Nations. So all nations are evaluating this. So what we see here is that we have a lot of risk. And then what I'd like you to do is look down at the next, the next section, which are hazard statements and precautionary statements. There's also a signal word there and 3 pictograms. Under OSHA, the GHS program, we can have up to 9 pictograms. The fact that this one has 3 different pictograms on it indicates that this is pretty high risk chemical. The hazard statements, highly flammable, toxic if swallowed, causes damage to organs for eyes and central nervous system. All of these tell us that this is a chemical we don't want to mess with. We want to protect ourselves from this chemical. We want to make sure that we're not dumping it down our laps or running it down our arms if we're going to do some bulk processing of this particular chemical. We've got to make sure that we're taking care of ourselves and that we don't have any contact any contact with this chemical, if at all possible. I want you to keep in mind that the hazard statements and the precautionary statements that are listed here on this slide, it's only about half of what were present on the safety data sheet. I couldn't fit them all in. So what our takeaway is on this methanol or on our windshield washer solution, which is mostly methanol. This chemical is really flammable. It's really toxic, and it's going to be volatilizing at room temperature. It's flammable, so we're going to see a lot of volatilization or evaporation off of this. Anytime we have something that's very flammable, it's a good possibility that with that volatilization, it's going to present us with some inhalation risk. So we've got to make sure that we're in some way, shape, or form trying to direct those vapors away from us. So all of that information just from one section of the safety data sheet. Next section that I turn to, so I turn to section 2 first, and then I turn to section 8. Now, section 8, if you haven't been doing EHS work for a long time, can look really daunting. There are a lot of abbreviations. There are a lot of unfamiliar words. So I'm going to teach you also the down and dirty method of evaluating using section 8, evaluating your level of risk. The way that I look at this is over the years, I've identified chemicals and segregated them into essentially 3 different classes or categories. I call them 3 zones. The first one is if I've got any of those numbers in that control parameter, and it doesn't matter if it's the TWA, PEL, REL, STEL, it doesn't matter what that abbreviation is to begin with. If any of those numbers are 50 parts per million or less, I put that into the red zone. That is a chemical that's going to try to hurt me very quickly in all different kinds of ways. I need to protect myself at the fullest extent from any exposures to that particular chemical. My yellow zone, and this is just my experience, my yellow zone is 50 to 500 parts per million. What that means is that I'm going to pay attention to that chemical. I'm going to make sure that I'm protecting myself from any exposure to that chemical. It is still a very dangerous chemical. It's not in the red zone, but it's still going to present me with quite a bit of risk. And then the last zone is the green zone. Anything with any of those numbers at 500 parts per million or more, 500 parts per million or more, still dangerous to me, still presents risk. If it didn't present any risk, those numbers wouldn't be there. So 500 parts per million or more, I'm not going to pour it on my Cheerios. I'm not going to go inhale it intentionally. I'm going to still continue to protect myself from that chemical. But if I have a choice of using a chemical with something 500 parts per million or more versus a chemical with 50 parts per million in any of those categories, I'm going to pick the one that's 500 parts per million. Okay, so that's just kind of my down and dirty. So now by just looking at those two sections of the safety data sheet, I can very quickly assess that this is a flammable chemical. It's got quite a bit of toxicity associated with it in a variety of different exposure routes. And so if I have a colleague that's been exposed to this chemical, the bottom falls out of that plastic, old brittle plastic jar or jug, I'm going to get them under a decon wash, and I'm probably still going to ask some medical advisement. We're also going to remove any contaminated clothing. So ideally, they're in a Tyvek suit that doesn't have any permeation to it. We can just remove the Tyvek suit. Those are the things that we need to be prepared with at HHW facilities, and particularly at events. If you have this happen to one of your colleagues or a volunteer, how are you going to respond to that? And so those are things that I'm going to encourage you to pay attention to and make sure that you're addressing before the event occurs. In the emergency response community, we actually take 20, 30 minutes and we'll sit down and run a scenario. It's called a tabletop exercise. It doesn't have to be super in-depth. Sometimes tabletop exercises get very, very, very detailed and very in-depth and will take all day long. You can run a short tabletop exercise in 15 minutes with your team, just by sitting down in front of them and saying, hey, what if, Mr. Jones pulls in and, he's a sweet old man, awesome that he's bringing his HHW into us. He pops open his trunk and we go to pick up the jug of windshield washer solution, the bottom falls out. What are we going to do? What's our response? Those are the types of things that we need to prepare for upfront and really pay attention to. All right. One of the other resources, if you can't find a safety data sheet, the safety data sheet is going to give you your best option for each individual chemical, or sometimes, depending on the product, if the product that you're looking for a safety data sheet is used in industry as well as by consumers, you will be able to find a specific safety data sheet for that most of the time, vast majority of the time. The other option you also have is what's used by the emergency response community. It's called Cameo. It's an app on your phone. It's free. And if you're working at if you're working at HHW facilities and you don't have Cameo on your phone, I think you're missing out. So I would encourage you, please download the Cameo app and play with it. And one of the nice things that you can do with Cameo that you can't necessarily do with chemicals without safety data sheets is that you can stack chemicals in Cameo and click a button, and it will give you information that of what will happen or what the risks will be if more than one chemical is blended. So let's say we have a really, really bad day and we have a truck full of paint thinner with the predominant ingredient being methylene chloride that sideswipes one of our customers with 55 gallons of motor oil in their trunk. Okay. Oh, that's a bad day. Very bad day. And all of a sudden we've got motor oil and we've got methylene chloride blended. Under Cameo, you can actually enter both of those chemicals, methylene chloride, motor oil, and see what that combination leads to. We're not going to do that, but I encourage you, again, download Cameo, play with it, get familiar with how it works before you have your events, or as soon as possible if you've got a permanent facility. Again, it's free. It was built for emergency responders. However, it was built by a number of government agencies working together, so the information is outstanding. It integrates CDC information, NIH information with Coast Guard, with EPA, and with OSHA. So it's a great tool. And it's one of my favorites to use on site. If I'm on site, I typically have Cameo open and ready to go, just in case. Okay, for personal protective equipment that we should have just in place for standard operations at an HHW facility or at an event. I'm a firm believer that if we've got anyone working anywhere near where the chemicals are, that they need to have safety glasses on at a minimum. I have just seen too many times where containers have, they've been dropped, they've been leaking, they've presented risk. Safety glasses are very affordable. Do they make you sweat more? Yes. Are they uncomfortable on hot days? Absolutely. Do they fog up? Yes, they can. There are resolutions for the fogging. You can spray some spray on the inside of them and they don't fog. Unfortunately, I think the spray probably contains PFAS. We'll talk more about that in the next few minutes. I just firmly believe that for the cost and the impact, safety glasses can make an enormous difference and are a benefit to anybody that's working anywhere near chemicals. If you have folks that are working where they're bulking chemicals, or it seems like there are a lot of vapors floating around, you can really detect a smell. I would encourage people in that situation to use chemical resistant goggles. Our eyes are very viscous. They like to absorb all of those chemicals, particularly for people that are wearing contacts. I would encourage you to not wear contacts at an HHW event or at a permanent facility. It's just too easy for your contacts to either absorb the chemicals themselves or for those chemicals to be sequestered between the contact and your eye, causing additional absorption through your eye. I think chemical resistant goggles are really the way to go if you're dealing with a lot of vapors, a lot of off-gassing of different chemicals. For general individuals, crush-resistant, chemical-resistant footwear, and disposable nitrile gloves as they're picking up and touching those HHW chemicals that are coming in. I think those things are critical. Now, if we do have additional chemical exposure, or we have somebody that comes in that's got a pickup truck full of chemicals because they cleaned out their great uncle's farm. In those instances, we need to beef up our safety. In those instances, I'm going to encourage you to put on Tyvek coveralls. Just the disposable nuisance kind are acceptable. Footwear, and then heavy duty chemical resistant gloves. So the disposable nitrile gloves are great. They tend to be 2 mil or 3 mil nitrile gloves. There are ones that are available that are called gauntlet style, and they go up to your elbows, and they tend to be about 10 or 15, 10, 12, 15 mil, depending on which type you buy. I would encourage you, if you're going to be unloading a lot of things, to actually put a pair of disposable gloves on and then use the heavy duty ones on top of those. It's just going to give you that one layer additional protection. Does this mean that you need to walk around at a hot event in your Tyvek all the time? No. In fact, we have to balance the level of risk associated with unloading chemicals with the heat issues with wearing Tyvek. It's very uncomfortable. One of the things that the gentleman that I worked at an HHW facility for about 10 years, and one of the tricks that the gentleman learned was that frequently exposure would happen on the front of their Tyveks. So to give themselves a little breathing room, so to speak, they would actually tear a line or tear a hole in the back of the Tyvek suits. That gave them a little temperature control. It allowed them to sweat a little bit easier. But it also provided splash and spill resistance for any of the chemicals that came out of those HHWs that presented risk through exposure. One of the questions I get frequently when I'm doing training is, I got somebody that they have their own air purifying respirator or APR, face mask with cartridges. Can they wear that when they, when they come and volunteer at our site? No, I'm sorry, they can't. If you have anybody in an APR, you need to have a full respiratory protection program. OSHA and a lot of the agencies are very stringent about that. If they're a volunteer, it gets a little muddier. However, I'm just going to tell you, I think it's a bad idea to have people bring their own air purifying respirators. A lot of times people don't understand fit testing and cartridge selection and level of risk and medical monitoring. And so because of all of those reasons, I don't believe that you should have APRs. Now, if you have concerns about people being exposed through inhalation to vapors, one of the simplest tricks that we've come up with over the years is to put a fan behind your people and blow the vapors away from them. So if you've got people that are working, unloading car trunks in the back of trucks, pickup trucks, if you put a fan to their side, you can blow those vapors away from them, and it will minimize their significantly minimize their exposure just from a simple fan. All right, one of the biggest challenges at HHW events and facilities is leaking containers. So please make sure that you've identified ways to manage those ahead of time. We talked last time about spill kit contents. I'm sorry, I've got a question from Suzanne. Okay, if someone volunteers and wants to wear an APR, should this be allowed? OSHA allows this. That volunteer area is a really, really gray area. And because we've got different states on here, I'm not going to give you a specific answer, Suzanne, and I'm sorry. But it's much more complicated than just a yes, no answer. If you are in an OSHA state, an OSHA regulated state, and you have a person that is an employee, they must be participating in a respiratory protection program. Now, volunteers, that's where the gray area gets fuzzy. Most states and most OSHA interpretations, and again, I'm treading very lightly here, okay? So bear with me. But most of the time, OSHA says, you know what? If it's a volunteer or just somebody that's showing up, we don't have jurisdiction over them, so they can do what they want. I'm going to advise you, though, because that's such a slippery slope, I would not allow that. If I was running an HHW facility or an event and I had a volunteer that was that concerned about exposure that they wanted to wear their own APR, I wouldn't let them work with chemicals. If they were that concerned, I would put them on something like handing out surveys or taking phone calls. And I would say no, unless you're a part of a medical monitoring program that, my facility is overseeing, nobody's going to wear APRs. So, and that's, again, that's really tough. It's almost a facility by facility decision. So it's a tough area because you want to make sure that people are protected, but at the same time, we've got to make sure that we're following the legal requirements. So gray area and really tough. I'm sorry, I don't have a better answer for you. If you want to discuss that offline, we certainly can. So let me know. All right, spill kit contents. We went over this last time and I wanted to just touch on it again today. There are some specific things that you really want to have at HHW events. One of the best things that I've seen is a large collection of zip close gallon bags, 2-gallon bags, and then also some, we usually call them 5-gallon poly bucket liners. They're heavy duty large plastic bags. Those will serve as an immediate secondary containment for you. So have a large collection of those available to you. Because unfortunately, we do see a lot of leaking containers and very brittle containers. So that's the other thing that I wanted to mention that I didn't talk really a lot about last time is as you are working, if your staff is involved in removing chemicals from trunks, backs of trucks, if you are touching the chemicals, if your staff is touching the chemicals or you have volunteers that are touching the chemicals, I would like very much for you to train them that they take a few seconds, just a few seconds, to observe the chemicals that are present And if there are any that are leaking, old, compromised, or look brittle. Because if we can get ahead of a spill by identifying something as a brittle container and putting it in secondary containment before we do anything with it, we can minimize almost all of our exposure risk. So I would really encourage you to think about how can you identify containers that are brittle, that are old, that are compromised before anybody moves or touches them. And if that's the case, it may take a couple of people working together with those large bags. And I've seen that work over the years very well. I've got some neutralizing absorbents on the list. And then you, of course, want to have things like kitty litter, booms, spill pads, that type of thing. One of the things also I just wanted to mention during this is I would encourage you, if you do have a facility, a permanent facility, practice a spill drill every once in a while. Take a 1-gallon can of water and dump it on the floor and say, hey, uh-oh, we had a spill. What are you going to do? And use the materials and practice the spill response. I work with industry all the time, and this is one of the things that we've done is implement once or twice a year that we practice a spill drill, and it makes a difference in your folks' confidence in responding to spills and in how they handle things. So I think it's really important to practice spill drills. The other piece of that information is when they practice, make sure that they're building a berm or a dike on the exterior of the spill. They want to contain the spill first, then worry about absorbing it. I was just at an industry site about 6 months ago. We had a spill. They hadn't practiced. They had no experience. There's very little confidence in the team that responded to it. And what they did is immediately take their spill pads, which were in pretty finite supply, and start popping them onto this spill. That didn't prevent the spill from moving. So we want to stop and contain the spill first, then absorb it. So we're still doing a little training with those folks. But it takes experience, and you want to build those neural pathways of, okay, spill happens, this is what I do. All right. Now, we're going to dive into one of our main topics for today, and that is vaping products. Vaping products are giving people headaches all over the United States right now. They've soared in popularity in the past 20 years, and we've really seen them increase in popularity in probably the last 5. We're going to go through some statistics. We're going to identify some risks associated with them, and then talk about safe disposal options. Before we jump into this, though, I wanted to point out on the bottom right of the slide, you see a picture of a guy in white tie-back. That's Kyle Fisher. He's the Metro Waste Authority Household Hazardous Waste Facility Coordinator in Iowa, in Des Moines, Iowa. Outstanding resource. I've worked with Kyle for 25 years. He is a great dude, and he's provided me with a lot of information for today. Also on the bottom right is Jennifer Volkman. Jennifer Volkman works for the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. I met her years ago at the NAMA, the North American Hazardous Materials Managers Association conference. She is a phenomenal resource as well. And if you have the chance to join NAMA or attend anything with NAMA, the North American Hazardous Materials Managers Association, if you can go to their conference or participate in their webinars, they do a fantastic job. So Jennifer has provided me with a lot of the information about vaping devices and also with lithium batteries. And I believe she's got a grant. I need to check with her a little bit more on that. But if any of you have statistics on lithium battery fires in your facility, reach out to me, because I want to connect you with Jennifer. I know she was collecting data and information about that for a while. So lithium batteries, the problem or the primary challenge with these vaping devices, I'm sorry, I said lithium batteries, I mean vaping devices. Okay, with the challenges with these vaping devices are that not only do they contain a lithium battery, which can undergo thermal, uncontrolled thermal runaway reactions, they also contain frequently nicotine, which is, according to EPA, a P075 hazardous waste. Some states have interpreted those as pharmaceutical waste. Other states just review them as acutely toxic hazardous waste. So you need to specifically understand how your state requires you to manage these. But these are the challenges that we're running into. In addition to that, and this is something I did not know until I really have been diving deep into this, the little heating elements that are in some of these devices have chromium in them. So this is just like the trifecta of really bad stuff all shoved into one little package. Nicotine, PO75 hazardous waste, lithium batteries, typically universal waste, but also very reactive, and chromium, delisted toxic waste. So great combination. The nicotine pods, that's what they're called, can be refillable or they can be single use. The challenges here are that EPA classifies nicotine as an acutely toxic hazardous waste. The OSHA permissible exposure limit is 0.5 milligrams per meter cubed or parts per million, 0.5. Remember that falls under that red zone, 50 parts per million. So this is a really nasty chemical. The nicotine containing e-liquids are very much absorption risks. So if you have one of those pods crack open and the nicotine juice gets on your hands, make sure that you're washing it off quickly because it is an absorption risk. As of between April of 2022 and March of 2023, there were actually more than 7,000 exposures to that nicotine juice. And 88% of those were children under 5. So this is a big risk in our communities right now. And the other thing is those lithium batteries, if they're damaged, can undergo that thermal runaway. As I was researching for this, I got really down the rabbit hole in a number of different statistics, and I wanted to share these with you so that you can build case for, or actually determine what's necessary for you to build a program to collect these and get them out of the community. I will tell you, recycling them, not going to be a great, option. And we'll talk more about that. Kristen asks, how common is it for HHW collection programs to accept vapes? I have talked with 5 different states so far about whether or not they're collecting them, and most are offering them as an option. Probably the most extensive person that I talked with was Kyle here in Iowa, and he said they have a program, they will accept them, but they don't get very many in. I also talked with one of our, and we're not going to talk much about this, but we have a dispensary here in the metro area, and I talked with them about their THC containing vapes, and they have been asked by their clients to set up a collection container for them. And when I started digging into how we would get rid of, properly dispose of vape cartridges or vape devices that contain THC residue, as well as lithium batteries and potentially chromium, it was going to be a nightmare. And we were going to have to handle that. Clean Harbors issued me an off-the-cuff quote of $10,000 for a five-gallon bucket. So I don't know if that's an accurate quote. I think he was just being facetious, but you know, this is a challenge. This is a big challenge. Just getting rid of the nicotine vapes with the lithium batteries is very expensive and a challenge. And Kristen, like I said, I talked to 4 different states, HHW facilities, permanent facilities, and they all have the option of collecting them, but it didn't seem like people were getting very many of them, which also concerns me because that means they're probably going in the trash. All right, statistics. We've seen a 196% increase in disposable one-time use of vaping devices, one-time use vaping devices. And the reason for that is, and you have to dig into this a little bit to understand it, FDA in March of 2020 made the decision that there were flavored juices that were too targeted at children, at people younger than 21 or younger than 18, depending on the state you're in. So FDA said, you know what, we're not going to allow sales of reusable, refillable cartridge devices in certain flavors. And the legislation that was proposed and passed and implemented specified refillable cartridges. So what happened is we had a bunch of manufacturers that flipped over to single-use devices. And single-use devices increased because they still had the variety of flavors that people wanted, increased by 196%. So we had some really bad unintended consequences from that particular legislation. We are seeing disposable vape unit sales, and this is March 2023 was the most recent information that I could get, of about almost 12 million devices a month, which means that we're seeing disposal of these at about almost 5 vapes per second are being disposed of in the United States. And these, again, these are nicotine containing vape devices, not THC. When I started going down the THC rabbit hole, it got really confusing, really difficult, and there weren't a lot of good answers. The lithium devices that we see that are being thrown away where the lithium is not being reclaimed weigh an estimated 23.6 tons per year, which is enough lithium to create batteries for about 2,600 electric vehicles. Craziness, craziness. And again, in these single unit devices, because the lithium batteries are a part of the device, they're very difficult to separate the batteries out. And in fact, most HHW facilities will not separate those batteries out because they tend to spark when you try to get them out. So lots of danger. And in addition, this is, the lithium is a finite earth metal. It's mined and it's water reactive. It's a pretty crazy chemical. All right, so who manufactures vapes and what are the sales, or what are the sales that we see? So June of 2024, I found statistics and it said that the number one vape manufacturer was Reynolds American Tobacco Company with about almost 39% of sales, and then Juul with about 28% of sales. Total revenue in 2023 from vape devices was $8.27 billion. And we have not seen any, producer responsibility, product stewardship initiatives that I'm aware of. There may be some state to state, but at this point in time, I don't believe that we're seeing any. The vape devices from residents, technically, of course, they fall under that exclusion that says residential hazardous waste is not hazardous waste. They can be disposed of under the exemption. However, when they are collected at places like hospitals or shopping malls or schools, they fall out. In most cases, they fall out under and do not meet that residential exclusion. So when they're collected at schools, for example, in most states, please make sure you're checking this with your state because each state handles it a little differently. But if these are collected at schools, let's say they're confiscated from a high school and they're collected, they then have to be managed as hazardous waste and the school becomes the generator. Very difficult. Pam says that vaping devices are included in the new Vermont hazardous waste EPR law. Yep. And I'm watching that really closely. So, and I think a number of us are. Vape devices, and that becomes a real challenge because, if we're in a high school and all of a sudden we've got a bunch of students vaping and we confiscate those, then all of a sudden that brings, an enormous level of regulatory compliance challenges to that school. Frequently when schools are not very astute about hazardous waste regulations and laws. So big challenges in this area. If you do decide to collect vape devices at your HHW facility, please make sure that you're aware of the absorption exposure risk for any of those devices. And then also make sure that you're prepared if those lithium batteries are damaged. And we'll get more into the details of lithium batteries next. But for disposal considerations, if you're going to collect these, I would encourage you for broken or heating or warm devices, please, number one, make sure that if you're collecting them, that you've got at least disposable nitrile gloves on. We want to make sure that you're not being exposed to the nicotine content. Through those nitrile gloves, though, you should be able to feel if that device is heated. If it's hot, if it's swelling, if it's reacting in any way, smoking, sparking, any of those types of things, you need to have a plan in place for where are you going to put those reacting devices. Even though those lithium batteries are small, they can light themselves on fire very quickly. And those fires are very difficult to put out because, again, we're dealing with a water reactive substance. So what we want to do is we want to have a segregated, closed, watertight container. The ones that come to mind most that I've encouraged people to purchase are those self-closing flammable cans that are made of metal. And then I would prepare to either put sand in the bottom of it, although I have to be honest, I don't prefer sand. I like a product called Cell Block. Cell Block is a fire suppressant and it's very effective at extinguishing lithium battery fires. It's also it's very fast, much faster than vermiculite and much more effective than sand. So Cell Block, it is expensive, but I think it's worth it. And then those containers that you're collecting, those altered devices or those DDR, damaged, or I can't remember what the other D stands for, or reclaimed, recalled devices. We'll get into that when we talk more about lithium batteries. But if you're collecting those and they have been altered or they're showing damage, signs of damage, swelling, heat, smoke, sparks, put them in the canister and then store. I'm probably going to get a little pushback on this, but I would strongly consider storing that flammable can, self-closing flammable can, on the exterior of your facility and away from people, away from vehicles, away from your facility. Because there is, thank you, damaged, defective, and recalled. I could never remember that middle D. So if you have any vapes that come in and they are DDR, damaged, defective, or recalled for those lithium batteries, store those outside of your facilities. We have just seen too many facilities that have burned to the ground because lithium batteries have decided to light themselves on fire. Also, if you're one of the facilities or you have a HHW program that relies on your contractor to collect everything, I would strongly encourage you to have a very serious conversation with that contractor. Do they have fire suppression that is adequate for lithium batteries that are DDR, damaged, defective, or recalled? Do they have those? Do they have cell block or some other type of fire suppressant? How are they going to plan to store or containerize those particular batteries? We do have some specific DDR designed shipping containers. One of the facilities that you can get these from is Call to Recycle, CALL, the number 2, recycle.org. Excellent recycling facility for different batteries. And they can help educate you on what DDR packaging looks like. But typically it's a metal can or a metal steel drum with cell block fire suppressant inside of it. If you do decide to receive in vape devices from your HHW facility, I would encourage you, if they're single-use devices, be very cautious before you decide to go ahead and try to remove those lithium batteries unless there are specific instructions on removing them safely. And then when you do receive vape devices from residents, one of the ways that you can ask them to make those devices as safe as possible, there are small on-off switches on those single-use devices. Ask them to put those in the off position. That does help prevent that lithium battery from continuing to operate and potentially from breaking down. The vape juice is, as I've said, an absorption risk. So please, before you handle any of these devices, make sure that that you're protecting yourself from any of that absorption. Highly toxic. Okay, if anybody has any questions about any additional questions on vaping devices, please go ahead and put them in the chat. We'll see what, I'll see if I can get to them. All right, the next section that we're going to talk about is lithium batteries. And I have to tell you, this is what keeps HHW permanent facility people up at night. And frankly, it also keeps our hazardous waste TSDFs up at night. This has become very scary. Our lithium batteries, what we're seeing is an unending number of products that now contain lithium ion or lithium batteries. Is everything from birthday cards that sing you a nice little song to flashing buttons that you can wear to, yes, Susan just put in the Veolia has a similar product to cell block, and that's correct. A number of the hazardous waste facilities have come out. I think Clean Harbors has their own brand as well. They call it recycled glass bead suppressant or something like that. I'm using cell block as kind of the overview generic. And they were the first ones to come to the market with an effective lithium fire suppressant. So, all right, back to lithium batteries. So we are seeing lithium batteries in so many enormous products. The disposal of them is really, for the most part, uncontrolled. There are a lot of times that residents may not even recognize that they're dealing with a lithium battery. They just throw those devices in the trash when they stop working. With these increased numbers of lithium batteries that we're seeing in a slew of different products, we are also seeing a significant increase in fires and fatalities associated with those fires across the country. The other thing that has changed in the last few years is that we now have a number of very large energy dense batteries. These, the density or the amount of charge is measured in watt hours or WH. And previously, up until about 5 years ago, 3 to 5 years ago, we saw a maximum WH capacity of about 300, so 300 watt hours. Now we are seeing, particularly with micromobility devices, so things like hoverboards and e-bikes and scooters, we are now seeing anywhere up to 3,000 watt hours, 5,000 watt hours. So as Jennifer put it, they are small power plants that are now driving around on hoverboards. And as a result of that, they've become very dangerous. The cost to collect these, store them correctly, handle them, package them, ship them, and then destroy them, because a lot of times they may not be able to be recycled, has become a significant challenge for household hazardous waste facilities. And we've seen that throughout the entire nation. Now, lithium is the reason that we've moved to lithium away from like nickel cadmium batteries or mercury batteries even, is because lithium is has the highest charge to weight ratio. So we get the most watt hours out of the smallest amount of lithium. The thing that we need to keep in mind is also that lithium is water reactive, which is why if we have an EV that lights itself on fire, an electric vehicle that lights itself on fire, and it has a lithium battery inside of it, what we see initially, if the fire department puts water on that lithium battery, the flames get bigger and it gets more explosive. That's because we're dealing with a water reactive metal. In lithium batteries specifically, there's a cathode side, a plus side, and a minus side. And those are separated inside the battery by a physical barrier. They call it a separator. And usually that separator has an electrolyte solution flowing back and forth between the cathode and the anode. Okay, the reason that it's important for you to know that is because the damage to the separator or damage to the amount of electrolyte solution that's in there can cause those, that's what causes those lithium batteries to begin what's called a thermal runaway reaction. What that means, okay, Pat says the lithium in lithium ion batteries is not elemental lithium and it's not water reactive. Only lithium primary non-rechargeable batteries contain elemental. So they are the only ones that are water reactive. That's true. The lithium in lithium ion batteries is a lithium salt solution. And the electrolyte solution that separates the two. However, I've talked with a number of fire personnel that have experienced additional reaction from those lithium batteries when they initially put the water on those fires. So there's something happening when they add water to the fire. And it causes that thermal runaway reaction to move even further out of control. What we see with, there are a number of different types of damage to those lithium ion batteries that can result in these thermal runaway reactions. There are mechanical damage issues where that separator is damaged and the cathode and the anode start continuously reacting. We also have electrical damage that can happen, as well as thermal abuse. Thermal abuse meaning I left my cell phone on the front dash of my car and the interior of my car reached 125 degrees. Now my battery is kind of hot all the time and swelling up. That's an indication that we've had thermal damage to that particular battery. And anytime we have any of those indications of thermal damage, heat, smoke, spark, swelling, any of those are an indication that that battery is getting ready to run into thermal runaway. And that's what we want to avoid. That's when those batteries light themselves on fire. And those fires can be they run very, very hot and they can be very difficult to extinguish. Short circuits in those batteries lead to heat generation as well as toxic gas release. The toxic gas that's released is most often hydrofluoric acid gas. Very dangerous. This is something you don't want to expose yourself to. Statistics that I evaluated as I was digging into what we're seeing from these thermal runaway events include that we are now seeing more than 5,000 fires a year at recycling facilities. I actually interviewed, we have a local resource recovery center, which is essentially, it's kind of a transfer station for residential waste that comes into a facility. And then a vast majority of it goes into, it goes into incineration with a coal-fired power plant. So it's supplemental energy from residential trash. We have a facility like that that's very close to us. I talked with them and I said, you know, how often are you guys seeing fires on that transfer station floor? And she said, oh, daily to weekly. She said, it's just a common occurrence. I said, okay, so how are you handling that? She said, well, we hope that the fire starts on the floor, because if it starts on the floor, we can isolate that area out and let it burn. If it doesn't start on the floor and it's in our conveyor system, then we have a really big problem. And that's one of our biggest fears, biggest concerns. So as the gentlemen in the facility are moving from the transfer floor onto the conveyors to go over to the power plant for incineration and energy recovery, they are very well trained in keeping an eye out for these types of batteries. But of course, you know, they're very hard to detect. We're seeing them in all kinds of different types of packaging. So it's really tough to figure those out. 41% of these fires have resulted in catastrophic losses in the past 5 years. In Minnesota alone, they've seen 245 fires. And this statistic was really interesting. So the Massachusetts Department of Fire Services specifically put in place a different type of inspection, post-fire inspection process, where they specifically look for lithium batteries as the source of fires. And what they found, prior tracking before they put this system in place was indicating that they were seeing 19.4, right around 20 lithium fires per year. They put this new process into place, oops, and that should say 24, in October of 2024, and monitored it until April of 2024. I'm sorry, that should say 2023. October of 23 to April of 24. And in that time, they identified 50 fires. So in a 6-month period, they identified twice as many fires that were the result of lithium-ion batteries. And this was that was a very big surprise. So they've definitely increased and are now using this process to evaluate all their different fires. In New York City, in 2023, they had 267 fires, 18 deaths associated with lithium fires, and 150 injuries. And then again, in Ames, they're experiencing about 1 fire a day on the transfer floor. One of the things that's come up, and I would encourage you, there's a Consumer Product Safety Commission committee that is evaluating this, particularly the lithium-ion batteries that are coming in from other countries. And what they've seen is that 84% of lithium batteries were manufactured in Asia. And a lot of those batteries, not a lot, a number of those batteries are coming into the United States, and they present more risk because they often the cells aren't segregated correctly. And if you have a lot of interest in this, I would encourage you to pull up the recent meeting that the Consumer Product Safety Commission had with a number of industry experts, particularly focused on bike batteries, on e-bike batteries. And what they found was in 2023, the forum was held in July of 2023, and they focused it on e-bikes, scooters, and other micromobility devices like hoverboards. And they found that there are no current standards for these batteries, which is why it's, we're seeing all over the place these fires, and many of them are resulting from poorly manufactured batteries. As you are accepting these at HHW facilities, please make sure that you're evaluating them to make sure that they have not been damaged. Now, the problem is you may look at them and they may look perfectly normal. So one of the things that you can do is make sure that you're packaging your lithium batteries correctly. And by correctly, I would encourage you to use the steel 55-gallon drums if you're recycling them, and the cell block, or the recycled glass bead fire suppression systems that are available to you. I would not put them in cardboard boxes, fiberboard boxes, not a good plan. And then before you prepare for that event, I would make sure that you have plenty of those materials on site and that you have a plan in place and you practice the plan for what you're going to do, how you're going to handle a damaged battery should it come into you. Other disposal considerations: practice the response to that damaged lithium battery. Isolate those outside of your facility. Discuss your responses to thermal runaway fires with your contractor. Make sure that they have a plan in place if you're relying on a hazardous waste contractor. And then consider implementing what's called the one drum solution by Call to Recycle. And this was, I really like this solution. It's kind of a one-stop shop. So if you're receiving in any types of batteries, not just not just lithium, but also nickel, cadmium, or any of the other types of batteries, you can put them all in one drum with cell block. Call to Recycle will tell you how to manage those and package them so they're as safe as possible. Now, if you have a permanent facility and you are receiving in a lot of lithium batteries, one of the other things that I would encourage you to look into, and you don't have to use this particular brand, this one just had a number of, they've won some Einstein Awards, and they've got, I think, some really good solutions. But basically, the company is named Fire Rover, firerover.com. And they've implemented the use of FLIR thermal imaging cameras. These are the heat detection cameras that fire departments have used for a very long time. And what they do is they install these thermal imaging cameras and they sweep across an HHW facility and detect temperatures. They also can be looped into fire response systems. They can be looped into fire suppression systems where they have a standalone foam firefighting device that when the FLIR camera or the thermal imaging camera picks up heat generation, that device activates and immediately sprays that container down with fire suppression. So something I think all of our permanent facilities should consider and look into. I think it's a good solution. Okay, this last section that we're going to talk about, this one's going to be tough, and I'm going to really get into the chemistry weeds on it. So bear with me, okay? But I think it's something very important for all of you to understand and have a good picture of, and also to understand the history and how we kind of found ourselves in this situation. So PFAS, and that's the name that I'm going to be referring to, the group of polyfluorinated alkyl substances. So I'm going to be referring to these as PFAS. And the way that I look at this is that these are a classification of chemicals. It's a large class of chemicals, but basically all of them have a carbon chain in the middle, and they have lots and lots of fluorine, polyfluorinated, lots and lots of fluorine molecules attached to them. Initially, polyfluorinateds were developed in about the 1940s or 50s. There's not a real clear date that I've been able to find. And they have, we saw them being developed in industry predominantly by 3M and DuPont. They were chemicals that have very appealing characteristics, and they were initially used in military applications. They are water resistant, oil resistant, chemical resistant, durable, and very stable molecules. They aren't impacted by heat. They aren't impacted by photodegradation. So these are chemicals that are really strong, really tough molecules, which is why they last for a very, very long time. These particular characteristics, the water and the grease resistance, the chemical stability, they can be used to minimize friction because they aren't heat generating and they aren't impacted by heat. All of those were very beneficial properties. So industry got very excited with these particular molecules and started identifying uses for them. Again, initially these were developed for the military, but then we had a couple of companies that said, hey, we could really use these in consumer products as well. And there are an estimated 15,000 different structures, different molecules that fall under the category of polyfluorinated alkyl substances. So what that means is that we have a class of molecule, carbon chains, lots of fluorines, and we can alter that chain a little bit chemically here and there. And we've developed now 15,000 versions of that plus, and they're continuing to be developed today. Highly fluorinated chemicals are really sought after in industry because of all of those beneficial characteristics. And one of the things I want to point out to you is where fluorine, and I know this is going to be in the weeds, but I want you to bear with me here, okay? I want you to look at where fluorine is on the periodic table, okay? And what we're going to get back to eventually is that it is in the same column as chlorine and bromine, okay? Fluorine, and the next chemical down is chlorine, the next chemical down is bromine. Okay, that becomes important to this story, okay? So I want you to pay attention to that a little bit. The most studied I'm sorry, I just had somebody insert some comments. Susan said, I can see over 300-watt lithium-ion batteries follow steel drums, but smaller batteries we collect in call to recycle boxes. Yes, the smaller lithium-ion are supposed to be okay with fire retardant labels in call to recycle boxes, correct? So we have to take a short online video training from the company. This is what Vermont transfer stations are doing. Yes, Susan, very good. yeah, the smaller watt-hour batteries are definitely not nearly the threat of those over 300 kilowatt-hour batteries, or 300 watt-hour batteries, rather. And Call to Recycle is an excellent resource. So if anybody else is looking for lithium battery recycling resources, Call to Recycle is an outstanding one. Okay, we're going to jump back into PFAS now. Okay, I've got to get my head wrapped around it again. All right, so one of the things that we've determined with these polyfluorinated chemicals is that because they don't break down, they show up in water, they show up in the air, they show up in people. They're bioaccumulative, and our bodies really don't know what to do with them. The most studied, one of the most studied PFAS molecules is called PFOA, polyfluorinated octanoic acid. And PFOA is one of the first molecules that falls under that PFAS category that was used for consumer products. It is a precursor to PTFE, which is polytetrafluoroethylene. Okay, so PFOA through a chemical reaction becomes polytetrafluoroethylene, or PTFE, and that is marketed by DuPont and has been for many years as Teflon. All right, PTFE has been phased out by DuPont because of concerns. PFOA has also been phased out. PFOA also at one point in time was referred to as C8. What that means is C8 stands for 8 carbons in the chain, and then everything else fluorinated around that molecule. As those have been decreased in use, so they're not completely gone, but as they have been phased out, DuPont switched to shorter carbon chains. So instead of C8, they've now developed C4 and C2 and C6. But again, the key to remember is they are still polyfluorinated substances. So the second generation, or called DuPont marketed it as Teflon Gen X, was still polyfluorinated carbon chains. They were just smaller. So what we continue to see is the buildup of these polyfluorinated chemicals in water, contaminated food, dust, and people's bodies. And we are just now on the cusp of identifying all of the risks associated with these PFAS. The largest epidemiological study was conducted around PFOA, polyfluorinated octanoic acid, again, the precursor to what's used as Teflon and marketed as Teflon. And that epidemiological study indicated to us that exposure to this increased rates of kidney cancer, testicular cancer, elevated cholesterol, preeclampsia, or high blood pressure in pregnant women, decreased fertility, thyroid issues, and altered immune system responses. And that was conducted by a giant epidemiological study that took place in the right around between 2010 and 2015. For additional information and to really learn about these polyfluorinated chemicals, as well as other potential threats, I would encourage you to investigate sixclasses.org. There are a series of short films or short videos that are extremely easy to understand. They were developed by the Green Science Policy Institute. They're very scientifically based, and really excellent resources. Now, one of the challenges that we have, and because as I've talked with folks over the year, they're just like, well, give me a list. Give me a list of PFAS that I need to avoid and products that they're in. And the challenge is, and the trouble is that these PFAS, these polyfluorinated alkyl substances, continue to change. We continue to change the molecule. That's why it's very difficult to detect the specific molecule, because most detection tests that are used for drinking water analysis, that are used for blood analysis, that are used for determination in contaminated soils, are very specific to one type of molecule. Well, here we're dealing with an ever-expanding class of molecules. So when we have one PFAS, such as PFOA, and it becomes problematic, or C8, and we know that it's become problematic, we develop tests to identify, okay, well, how much is in our drinking water? How much is in our soil? How much is in our food? And the challenge is once we see that there are problems with it, a lot of the chemical companies, not a lot, the chemical companies that are manufacturing these particular types of molecules slightly alter that molecule. So then we have to go through and develop new tests. And in order to develop standards, I think you all know how long it takes to develop and implement things like hazardous waste limits. We haven't addressed those as hazardous waste, even though we know they're bioaccumulative and they're dangerous for people. This is again the list on this slide of the different things that we've seen. And then I also provided you with what the PFOA molecule looks like. Okay, so this is the way that chemists describe molecules. They have a drawing of what the molecule looks like. And what I want you to notice on that top molecule, on the right side, there are 3 circles. Those are all different molecule or molecular structures that we can tack on to the end of that carbon chain to change that molecule a little bit. We can also add or subtract in additional carbon atoms and then coat them in fluorides. Changes the molecule again. Every time we change the molecule, we have to change the tests to pick up and detect the molecule in water, air, blood, soil. It takes time. Once we do that, then we have to run all kinds of epidemiological studies before we can implement limits. Also takes time. Well, as all that time is going by, what we're seeing is that we're continuing to see human impacts, and we're seeing elevated levels continue to build up in drinking water, soils. They are bioaccumulative. They've also been detected in fish and dairy products because they are bioaccumulative. So one of the questions that's come up is, well, who manufactures these? Who makes the PFAS? And again, keep in mind, PFAS is the class of chemicals. They're polyfluorinated, so lots of fluorine ions around those carbon chains with something different on the end, either an acid or hydroxide or something. In information that I was able to find from May of 2023, there was a paper listed in the Annals of Global Health. And if you have interest in this area, I would really encourage you to read this. Outstanding paper. And it was written by, I believe, a team at the University of California at San Francisco. Basically, it says it examined documents from DuPont and 3M, which are the largest manufacturers of PFAS and continue to be the largest manufacturers of PFAS. Now, however, the DuPont company has created a spin-off company to handle all PFAS called Chemours. So it's in 2015, DuPont took all of the PFAS research and put it under the umbrella of the Chemours company. And over on the side to the right, you see the chemical companies that are continuing to produce these polyfluorinated polymers, or fluoropolymers, as the European Chemical Agency calls them. The number one manufacturer is a company out of China called Shandong Dongyu. The number 2 is Chemours, spin-off of DuPont, and the number 3 is Daikin. 3M is still on the list at about 5% market share. When I continued to dig into this, in 2022, I researched the estimated revenue coming in just from these classes of molecules. And it's at about, worldwide, at about $28 billion a year. So we continue to see production of these classes of chemicals, of this class of chemicals. We just see different alterations of it being produced. EPA has recently, just in April of 2024, established drinking water limits for some of the PFAS molecules, PFOA and PTFE. The PFOA limit, initially when it was addressed, the chemical companies created statements that said that up to 150 parts per million of exposure to this material would be acceptable for humans in drinking water. EPA, after about an additional 9 years of research, dropped that limit and set the limit at 4 parts per trillion. So we skipped over the parts per billion and we went to parts per trillion. And for PFOA and for PFTE, the limits are 4 trillion, or about 4 parts per trillion in drinking water. That's a very clear message that basically says humans should not be exposed to this particular class of chemicals. It's damaging to us. The data continues to be collected on these. And again, the challenge here is there's not a list of PFAS. There are 15,000 chemicals that meet this criteria, and they're continuing to be developed today. The key thing you need to know is that all of the chemicals in this class have polyfluorinated criteria. So they have multiple fluorine ions or fluorine molecules on the compounds. It's going to be really tough to meet those drinking water limits, particularly since we continue to produce these types of molecules. PFAS is not currently, none of the PFASs are currently regulated as hazardous waste. So one of the things that, as I was discussing this with my HHW colleagues here in Iowa, they said, well, does that mean that we're going to start seeing Teflon pans come in at HHW events? I don't know. Maybe, but not right now. Right now, they're not hazardous waste. And if we just waved a magic wand and made them hazardous waste, it wouldn't just be pans. It would be lipstick and stain guard and carpeting and curtains and all sorts of stain-resistant chemicals that are found in human homes. It would be food products. One of the primary ways that people are exposed to PFAS is through food, in addition to drinking water. And the food products that are of concern are those with a slick surface on them. So they're resistant to grease, oil, water. Things like paper plates with a slick surface on them. Things like the papers that are used to wrap up food at fast food restaurants. All of those are considered, meet the criteria of PFAS. And so that's another way that we're being exposed. And again, there are so many out there that there isn't one way to just make a list and avoid the products, which is very unfortunate. As you are hearing more about this, and as those of us, particularly in the waste industry, are going to have to be dealing with the waste that comes from these products, there are some things that you can do to minimize your own risk. First thing that I want you to do is make sure that you understand the risks and the products of concerns. Take a look at the 6classes.org videos and then start being a smarter consumer. There are certain companies that have committed that they will not sell products that contain PFAS. And I know for our household, we're going to start focusing on supporting those industries. There's also a really outstanding document that the Massachusetts government issued. For those of you from Massachusetts, great job on this, okay? It's called Avoiding PFAS in Products, and it was developed by the Responsible Purchasing Network, and it was developed for the Massachusetts Operational Services Division. So it's basically a list of how do we buy things that we need to run our operations that don't have PFAS in them? It's an outstanding reference. And I would encourage any of you that are not familiar with it to pull that up, take a look, and see if you can implement it in your own operations. Excellent resource. The implications of all of this PFAS contamination are, we just don't know what they are at this point. They're extensive, they're scary, they're challenging, and we really don't know where all of this is going to go. And I still think that we don't fully understand the health implications of exposure to this. The kicker is folks, we've been here before. So the next couple of slides, I'm going to go through some chemicals that we've known for a very long time do not work and play well with human bodies. These are my thoughts over 30 years of working in this industry. And I have to tell you, I'm an old DuPont girl. My first real job out of college was working for DuPont in the development of Roundup Ready corn and soybean. And I was there for 5 years and I thought it was the greatest job in the world. I don't necessarily feel that way anymore. Decades of industrial production have shown us that there are 3 molecules in particular that really impact human health and the environment. Things, and they're all right next to each other in the periodic table: chlorine, fluorine, and bromine. All 3 of these molecules are in the same column in the periodic table because they have very similar chemical structures. They behave very similarly in the lab when we're messing with them. They're right next to what are called the noble gases. The noble gases are the most stable molecules that we have in the entire universe. Well, that we know of anyway. Right next to those is the column with fluorine, bromine, and chlorine. And those are extremely unstable chemicals. And the reason that they're unstable, and bear with me on this, I'm going to give you a little chemistry lesson here. But the reason that they're unstable is that they are seeking one final electron in what we call their outer shell. Okay. And I know I'm going to get deep into the chemistry, and I apologize for that. So what you're looking at here are what are called Bohr diagrams. This is the way that chemists talk to each other. One of the ways. And what you'll see on chlorine, when you look at those circles around, what's in the inside is the inside of the molecule itself. So that's the nucleus of the molecule. Those circles indicate how electrons float around the outside of the molecule. So there are protons and neutrons in the nucleus, and then electrons spin and float around the outside. And they float in different layers. And there are a certain number of electrons that can be in each layer. The inside layer contains 2 electrons. The next layer contains 6 electrons. The next layer contains 8 electrons. Well, if we have a molecule that only has 7 electrons in that outer layer, and it wants 8 really bad, because that makes it most stable, it's going to search around until it finds that 8th molecule. That's the similarity between the chlorine, the bromine, and the fluorine ions, or the fluorine molecules. They all have one space for an extra electron in that outer shell. So when they find it, for example, if a fluorine molecule bonds to a carbon molecule, that bond is very strong. And as soon as that outer layer is filled, that molecule does not want to give up that extra electron. So it holds on to it. It's very stable. That's where the very strong bonds, they do not degrade. And that's where we come up with the concept of forever chemicals, because they just don't degrade in nature. We've made them super happy by sticking them onto other molecules that make them all stable. Because of this chemical structure, they have certain characteristics that we really like. They are oil and water resistant. They are thermal resistant. They can be subjected to very high temperatures, but it doesn't alter the chemical structure. It doesn't cause them to break down. And we've learned, we're really, really smart and have learned how to manipulate these molecules to put them into products. So we've seen this over the past 30 to 50 years, 80 years maybe. Originally, the original PFAS, polyfluorinated alkyl substance of concern, was PFOA. So you'll hear talk about PFOA. What I want you to think of is PFAS is the category, is the overarching category of molecules. PFOA is a specific type of molecule, polyfluorinated octanoic acid, referred to by DuPont as C8, that had 8 carbons in the chain and then fluorinated fluorine molecules all over the place. Very, very solid. What we did is we converted that to what's called PFTE. PFTE is the molecule on the bottom. And what you'll see is that molecular structure is marketed as Teflon. This is where the hard part to understand comes in. So I've shown you up here now some different molecules, and these are the specific PFAS molecules that have been identified by EPA and had limits set on them. These are the different chemical classes, or the different molecules as well as chemical classes. EPA tried to cover their bases by addressing both PFOA, polyfluorinated octanoic acid, as well as PFAS, polyfluorooctane sulfonic acid. You can understand why we use the abbreviations, don't you? It's crazy. And EPA has set limits on some of these. What we aren't keeping up with is the alterations to these molecules. So we may have defined limits for PFOA, PFAS, PFTE, but we haven't identified significant limits for the full fluorinated class of chemicals. And again, they're not listed as hazardous waste. So how do you know? How do you know where the PFOA, PFAS, or any of the other fluorinated alkyls, how do we know where they're located? We can identify based on the characteristics. If all of a sudden you see stain resistant, oil resistant, water resistant, thermally stable, any of those words in marketing literature, chances are we're dealing with PFOA, PFAS. There is no mechanism in place right now for chemical companies, once EPA regulates one molecule, for them to switch that molecule just a little bit and have now an unrelated, unregulated, sorry, not unrelated, a related but unregulated molecule. One of the other changes that we went through recently was through the abundance of AFFF foam in firefighting. It's been around for a long time, worked great because it was, again, thermally stable because it had lots and lots of fluorine. Speculation right now, we do not have the epidemiological evidence, but there is speculation right now that that may be one of the causes of elevated cancer risks that we are seeing in firefighters. We can't definitively link it at this point. The complexity of these chemicals and the number of products that these chemicals are used in has created an enormous challenge for us. It also makes it very difficult for waste handlers, for those of us in the waste industry, to figure out how we're going to protect our people and how we're going to manage these in the long run. At this point in time, incineration appears to be a viable option for destruction of these molecules, but I haven't seen enough evidence that shows that it's a really great idea. So I think that's, and I know that's still under investigation. I don't know that we have good answers. We've seen this same trend in the past. Okay. And these are some of the trends that we've seen. And Vicki, I have 48 slides, so we're still doing good. I've only got like 10 left, so we're still okay on time. I'm watching. Guys, we've been here in the past. We haven't been here with fluorinateds, but we've been here with chlorinateds. Again, working in the lab, we throw a bunch of chlorine molecules on a nice solid carbon base. We end up with really cool chemicals that seem to benefit us. We've done this many, many times. And I'll go through some of these examples, but the ones listed in the table to the right are the ones that we know cause various illnesses in humans. Now, this doesn't mean that we can come out and say, oh, never again, we can never use chlorine. Chlorine is a very useful molecule. We use it in pool chemicals. We use it to kill bacteria. We use it in bleach. What we haven't done is really vet how chlorinated chemicals, new chlorinated chemicals, are impacting human health and what their degradation rate is so that they don't become bioaccumulative. That's the biggest challenge here. Examples of chlorinated chemicals that we've seen over the years, perchloroethylene or tetrachloroethylene, okay? 4 chlorines on a nice solid base, great chemical for cleaning, solvent, wonderful for removing oils and greases off of automotive parts, fantastic as a dry cleaning solvent. Lasts for a really long time because it's a really, really stable molecule. Trichloroethylene, same thing, trichlor, solvent. PCBs, you know, fantastic addition to oils, kept them thermally stable pretty much forever. Only the problem is we not only see the bioaccumulation, we see the stability of these particular molecules, we now know that these are also carcinogenic. We see elevated health risks. Methylene chloride, just recently, EPA put methylene chloride on the no-no list, on the, I don't know if it's officially a banned chemical, but methylene chloride has also, we've had lots of awareness on it as a component of paint thinner. One of the other things and I didn't put it on here, I should have. If any of you have those beautiful little bubble lights, you plug them in, there's a solution in a light bulb and it bubbles. A lot of times people have them for Christmas lights. So we plug it in, it gets a little bit warm, it starts to volatilize. That's what those bubbles are. And the solution itself is methylene chloride most of the time. I had a run-in with Hallmark a few years ago because I pointed out that they were selling a carcinogenic toxin in their Christmas lights. The manager wasn't real pleased with that. But methylene chloride is one that's very common, and only now EPA has recognized it and put limits on it. Chlordane, strong, super awesome pesticide, lasts forever, highly chlorinated. Triclosan, this just recently was removed from hand soaps, foaming hand soaps. I actually Googled, where is triclosan still used as an antibacterial and antifungal? It's still being used by Colgate Total. So those of you that are using Colgate Total, you're brushing your teeth with a heavily chlorinated chemical that's designed as an antibacterial. Probably not the greatest thing. Bioaccumulative, bad for humans, bad for the environment. And we know this. We know that this particular molecule doesn't work and play well with human bodies. Next one, brominated chemicals. So remember, we looked at the periodic table and we saw chlorine, bromine, and fluorine. Brominated chemicals, also been studied for years and years. And these formulations also indicate that they're problematic for humans. They cause cancer, endocrine disruption, dermatitis, asthma, migraine, thyroid disorders, reproductive health impacts, autism, ADHD, other neurological or neurobehavioral disorders. Brominated chemicals are found in all kinds of household chemicals, all kinds of household chemicals. Oh, and I have an error on that slide. I have AFFF foam on there. It's not brominated, it's chlorinated. No, it's fluorinated, excuse me. I'm sorry, I apologize. I messed up on that. One of the most recent changes that we've seen is also the elimination of brominated vegetable oils, or BVO, from soft drinks. FDA just made that decision in the last, well, couple weeks, that we no longer need to have brominated vegetable oil in our beverages. We've also seen brominated fire retardants in things like children's clothing. And again, keep in mind that these are bioaccumulative. As we are exposed to them, they build up in our bodies don't know what to do with them. Actions to take to keep yourself safe. Keep your employees safe. Make sure that you're reviewing trusted sources. I've given you a list up here. Consumer Product Safety Commission for lithium, Green Science Policy Institute, Environmental Working Group, and the EPA. All are very focused. All four of those are very focused on PFAS right now. Make sure that you're getting your information from trusted sources. Keep learning and keep asking questions. One of the things that I found in looking at, I was actually looking at inks that are used in packaging to determine whether or not they have fluorinated compounds in them. They don't list them on the safety data sheets. They're in such small percentages that they don't have to. However, if you flip over and you look at the certified product data sheet, which is produced by the manufacturer, those will have the low level concentrations of fluorinated, chlorinated, or brominated compounds. Safety data sheets from Canada tend to have more information. European safety data sheets tend to have more information, may have these listed. And then also California Prop 65, that tends to be focused predominantly on heavy metals and known carcinogens. I don't know if California has added PFOA and PFAS, the category of fluorinateds, to their list, but I'm not sure yet. I would anticipate it's probably coming. Those are good resources as well. You want to make sure that as you are looking for those resources and trying to identify if they have chlorinated, brominated, or fluorinated components, these are some of the abbreviations that you will want to look for: chloro, chlor, bromo, brominated, perfluoro, polyfluoral, lots of other descriptions. If you have any specific questions, please reach out to me on email. And then I would encourage you, again, take a look at sixclasses.org. Also, there was a movie. I made my family watch it. They didn't really, they were a little freaked out. But Dark Waters actually covers a lot of the PFAS history. And it's a movie, so we have to take a lot of it we hope that it's fairly accurate information, but it does give you a good, strong overview of what happened with these particular chemicals. And then make sure that you help others understand these complex challenges. Uh-oh, my lights went out, sorry. All right, we're gonna skip over just a little bit and I'm gonna move a little faster now. I know those were really complex topics. Thank you for bearing with me on those. Common HHW that come in, last webinar, we talked about corrosives, poisons, and toxins. We could talk for a week about the number of different toxins and types of toxins that come in. We're going to talk a little bit today, just real briefly, about some of the unusual ones. I also wanted to give you some phrases for you to look at or listen for as you're working with HHW participants that are coming in. If you hear railroad, if you hear industry or industrial research, if you hear military collection, barn, cleaning out the old barn, or pharmacy, all of those are indicators to use. Those are all areas of industry that we tend to see a large number of chemicals come out of. And we also saw, particularly from up until about 1980, maybe 1990, we saw people taking chemicals home from those industries, only to end up having to dispose of them later. One of the things we've talked about bromine, I wanted to give you a picture of what bromine looks like. Everybody knows that chlorine is a gas. Fluorine is hard because there are a lot of different kinds of fluorines. What I want you to be aware of is this is actually what bromine looks like. And we do occasionally run into this in science labs in containers like this. So if you ever have anything that comes in that's a funky, weird brown gas that kind of moves around, it's a very unique substance. You want to be very, very careful with this. This is acutely toxic in its elemental form, very dangerous. The other thing I want you to watch out for, and we don't see these a whole lot, but munitions and ordnance, things like blasting caps, things like pipe bombs. The photo on the right here is from Dave Waddell, and it is old mining. I'm losing the word right now. I'm sorry, I can't remember the word right now, but it's an old mining explosive that was, oh, dynamite. Good grief. I can't believe I lost that word. I'm sorry about that. But it's old, unused dynamite. Dynamite, as it ages, becomes very, very, very unstable. So if you have anybody, yep, thank you, Eric. It is gel dynamite. Thank you. Appreciate that. Every once in a while, all those hazmat chemicals just kind of take over a little bit. But yeah, dynamite, we don't see it a whole lot. But if you are in an area where you have farms, where you have occasionally people would bring it home to do things like blow out old stumps. Okay. The longer it sits around, the more unstable it can become. So just kind of keep that in mind. Ask questions when your HHW folks are coming in. So this is what det cord looks like. It's actually a cord with an explosive built into the center. You light the cord, it burns all the way to your charge. And that's what these things are here, are the charges that are associated with the det cord. Anytime you see anything that looks like this, and most det cord does have a unique pattern to it, it has a unique feel to it, ask questions. These are not things that you should be seeing at your HHW. If you do have any of those, and I would prepare for this ahead of time, just in case. But these are ones that you need to take that resident, defer them off to the side, get them out of the line, get their vehicle away from everybody else's vehicle, and then make a call to your bomb squad person. Those are ones that we just don't have the technology to deal with at HHW facilities. These are old igniters, old detonators, and old chargers or primers. The thing with these old primers is that they look just like or very similar to firecrackers. They are not. They pack a heck of a punch. Okay, so if you see the word prime or primers on any containers, or anybody gives you an indication to that, please make sure, again, we want to divert those folks off to the side, keep them out of the flow of traffic, and then call our bomb squad person. And det cord is what Wile E. Coyote always used. Yes, det cord is, I've played with it a few times and it's really kind of fun. So I got to do many years with the bomb squad locally here. They were wonderful to work with. And we found some crazy chemicals in schools. And the safest way to manage those was to have the bomb squad come in. So exciting stuff, not something you want to see on a Saturday morning when you've got a line of cars. Okay. Next thing is cylinders. We don't typically receive these in. They can be extremely dangerous. All right. And the ones that I'm most concerned with are the ones that are very unusual. But again, we do see things like chlorine gas cylinders come in. These little lecture cylinders in the middle picture there, lecture cylinders are extremely dangerous. They're very old. Frequently, they have not been used for decades and decades, which has led to corrosion and instability of those tanks. They may feel very solid, but the tops of them, if the top explodes off, there's number one, they're small torpedoes, and number two, they're off-gassing acutely toxic gas that you don't want to be around. So this is one of those things that I would talk with your hazardous waste coordinator or hazardous waste contract company and say, what do you guys do with cylinders? Can you handle them if they come in? And this is another one where we want to make sure that we're screening those as much as possible up front. All right. The reason that we focus on all this stuff is to make sure that we keep you as safe as possible and that you keep your folks as safe as possible. By minimizing any incidents, we increase retainment of employees. We retain community support, particularly if we offer solutions to residents that are really in a pickle and don't know what to do. And overall, in the long run, safety is going to save you money and save you a lot of effort. So please make sure that you're focused on. Injuries are just not anything that we want to deal with. Accidents and injuries really prevent us from living a good full life. So we want to make sure that we're around to take care of our families and to have fun. So anytime, any effort that you can put into practicing up front, talking through or tabletopping different incidents, running a little spill drill, talking with your contractor on how unusual things would be managed, time well spent. Absolutely time well spent. Different examples of things that we want to ask our contractor. There's a few things that I've added to the list from last week. One is, are there any items that would be turned away? And that's one of the toughest challenges in running HHW programs is, you know, we like to think we can handle anything, and then crazy stuff shows up. Is there anything at your facility that you would turn away? And what would you tell the resident? Okay, and prepare for that up front. Make sure that you have adequate spill materials, that you have adequate and appropriate personal protective equipment, and that your people are trained in that. Have a quick discussion. These are things that you can do today. 5-minute activities, 20-minute activities that you can do today to improve safety at your facility. Have a quick discussion with your team and ask them some what if questions. What if this afternoon somebody brings you a coffee can full of leaking vape cartridges? What are you gonna do? What if somebody shows up with a coffee can full of leaking vape cartridges that have THC in them? And I don't have any good answers on that one. I don't think anybody does right now. Develop a plan for your damaged, defective, and recalled lithium batteries. What are you going to do? Do you have a place to sequester them that's outside of your facility? How are you going to keep your facility safe? Print a list of resources. Anytime you have an event, you should know what are peroxidizable chemicals. If any of those weird science chemicals come in, know which ones are presenting the most risk to you. A list of emergency contacts in the community. Scott asked the question, are there ways to test if cylinders are empty? Oh, Scott, that's a terrible question. It's a great question, but no, there are no good answers on that. And I'm sorry. I would work with your hazardous waste contractor and have them evaluate those, but no, not that I'm aware of. Anybody out there have any guidance? You're welcome to put it in the chat on how to test if cylinders are empty. Typically, what I advise people to do is collect them, segregate them off to the side, make sure they're safe and away from your building and people, and then work with your hazardous waste contractor to get rid of them. Reach out with any questions, comments, or concerns that you have. We're down to about the last 2 minutes. So here is my contact information. And I just want to tell you all, thank you so much. I know it's tough to get 2 hours out of your schedules, especially this time of year. Everybody's pushing hard, hopping, working fast. And I truly appreciate all of you joining us. So anybody have any other questions or last comments or anything?